Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Good afternoon. We are thrilled to have Jonathan Flatley with us virtually to kick off the opening day of Season of Warhol, the most exciting and significant presentation of art by Andy Warhol ever mounted in Rochester. 3 simultaneous exhibitions at MAG feature the work of celebrated American artist, film director, producer, and publisher, Andy Warhol. These are on view through March 28th. Included in Season of Warhol is Silver Clouds in the Lockhart Gallery, Warhol TV in the Media Arts Watch Gallery, and Cow Wallpaper in our Vanden Brühl Pavilion. Additionally, in the Docent Gallery, there is the major exhibition Andy Warhol Portfolios, A Life in Pop, Works from the Bank of America collection. A link to reserve your time tickets to visit MAG and explore works by Andy Warhol will be in the chat, so look for it there. And now on to today's program. First, I want to thank Dr. Hannah J. Sulky, my dear friend, for sponsoring this event. Hannah, thank you so much. We really appreciate your support. And I also want to thank all of you, our attendees, for tuning in for this presentation by Jonathan Flatley. Jonathan Flatley is a professor of English at Wayne State University. He is the author of Affective Mapping, Melancholia and the Politics of Modernism from 2008, like Andy Warhol from 2017, and he is a co-editor with Jennifer Doyle and Jose Esteban Munoz of Pop Out, Queer Warhol, published by Duke University Press in 1996. He is currently working on a book about Black Leninism and revolutionary counter moods. When you visit MAG, be sure to pick up a copy of Flatley's book, like Andy Warhol, from the store. I'll come back on the scene, on the screen, and on the scene, I suppose, for the Q&A toward the end of the webinar. But for now, it is my pleasure to welcome Jonathan Flatley. Jonathan, you have the mic.
Hey, thanks a lot, Jonathan and Rachel and Elisa, and thanks people for showing up at this Zoom event. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully you can see my screen, and I will do full screen. So, congratulations on the show. It looks spectacular. I'm going to try to stay around 35 minutes with my comments here. It's great to have all this material together in the show, the TV work, interview magazines, the silver pillows, the cow wallpaper. You can get a sense of the range of Warhol's work across all these different media, which of course also included film. He made these hundreds of films in the 1960s, and at the time thought of that as his sort of main occupation. He made books. He has a novel. He was constantly occupied with photography and drawing. He tape recorded all these conversations. And on the one hand, I think all the sort of range of his work presents difficulties for making sense of Warhol as an artist. How do we think of all this stuff together? Is there a coherent through line? The work is so various. On the other hand, I think it reminds us that the famous paintings of stars like Marilyn Monroe and Elizabeth Taylor or the Campbell soup cans are part of this larger project. And so instead of focusing on, Warhol's kind of scandalous rejection of the then dominant abstract expressionism, so here you have Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, de Kooning, instead of focusing on his rejection of this mode of painting, which focused on individual genius and painterly originality, creative self-expression, looking at all the material together might encourage us to think instead about Warhol's way of seeing the world, a whole sort of way of relating to, thinking about, and feeling about the world, and that's what he's trying to share that through his work. And so this is kind of my approach, to think about, okay, what's Warhol's way of seeing the world. So in this book, I wrote about Warhol I tried to make a case for sort of a way of thinking about his work that connects it all together, and that is liking things. His work is about liking. He's trying to teach us how to like more than we do, and liking not in the sense so much of, hitting the like button on Facebook. That liking is a way to collect data, to feed it into an algorithm, to better sell you things, or to get you to vote or not vote in a particular way. Warhol's liking, I think, is more about the development of a kind of emotional openness. Like everything, like it all, not as a means to some end, but as valuable in itself, as like a way to live. And in a world dominated or with certainly a strong strain of dislike and division and depression and withdrawal, I think this project remains highly relevant, if still surprisingly difficult. It was, during his life, no secret that Warhol liked to like things. He liked to say things like, I like everything, I like everybody, in response to questions about like, who's your favorite artist or who's your favorite movie star. He would generally refuse to state a preference, saying instead, I like them all. When a photo of Warhol eating from an open can of Campbell's soup next to one of his Campbell's soup can paintings appeared in a 1962 Time magazine story, that's what you're looking at now, the caption read, Warhol, just because I like it. His friends and associates, if you read through the stuff, it's filled with comments about his like talent for liking. Ronald Tavel, who worked with Warhol on several of his films, remembered that he frequently disagreed with Warhol about whether the films had to be boring. The problem, Tavel suggested, was that Warhol just didn't get bored like everybody else. He found something to like kind of no matter what. So my argument is that for Warhol, liking things was a project to be pursued, involving abilities that could be nurtured and educated. It's something you can learn to do and do better and do more often. I'm thinking about liking here as something like a fundamental value judgment, one that people make continually and automatically. Am I going to eat the banana or the apple? Which of my fellow subway riders draws my eye? Should I keep listening to this talk, or should I check Twitter? Will I nod my head and sway my hips to the rhythm of this music? It's less a discrete emotion than an elemental attraction, the most basic positive feeling one can have. It entails a readiness to pay attention to something and to be affected by it. As such, it's also an implicit affirmation of something's existence. And here is one of his, here's this interview where he talks about liking. So in proposing that Warhol's work is about liking things, I'm suggesting an alternative to a certain common sense view that understands his art and its machine-like use of repetition, for instance, as a defense against being affected. I think Warhol's liking is a practice, a kind of emotional labor, which aims to engage and transform the world in a context where, as Warhol put it, it would be much easier not to care. A feeling that I think persists. It's difficult, after all, not to be overwhelmed by the news each day. How do you avoid emotional withdrawal in that context? I think Warhol wants to try to draw us into his project of liking and expand it. As he said, I think everybody should like everybody. My case is that Warhol's primary method for pursuing liking as a project was an inventive and varied production of and attention to ways of being, acting, and looking alike. You can see here, oh, I can't do that on the screen. You can see that here in the interview. He expanded the force and reach of his liking through an array of aesthetic practices aimed at revitalizing what the German philosopher Walter Benjamin called our gift for seeing similarity. our gift for seeing similarity. Once you stop to think about it, you realize how much depends on that gift. Certainly things like making friends or caring about others or recognizing what kind of tree that is, but also learning pretty much of anything depends on our capacity to imitate sounds, movements, and so on. Benjamin, for his part, is especially impressed by those instances where we manage to see similarity across differences. Dances, for instance, that imitate the seasons, or even a good metaphor where we're able to think about how the bee's attention to the flower might be similar to the feeling of love. For Warhol, in any case, I'm suggesting there's no liking without the capacity to perceive likenesses and to be alike. I think it's worth emphasizing that being alike for Warhol is distinct from being identical or the same. And this is a huge part of its appeal for Warhol. After all, when something's like something else, it means precisely that it's not the same as it. Things that are alike or similar are not incommensurate, but they're also not identical. They're related, they resemble, but they're distinct. Similarity is thus a discrete concept aside from the same different opposition. And while I don't have time to talk about this today, I think this emphasis on likeness made space for Warhol to think about attraction, affection, and attachment without relying on the homo-hetero same different opposition. So central, is it same-sex desire or opposite-sex desire? This idea that's so central to modern ideas of sexual identity and desire. It also opened up a way to value male femininity and female masculinity instead of seeing the fairy or the drag queen, for instance, as an aberration, a departure from the norm. We can see them as beacons of mimetic talent, of the capacity to produce likenesses across difference. And this is a painting of Warhol's from 1975 in the Ladies and Gentlemen series, spectacular series of Black and Latinx drag queens that he did in the mid-70s. In his work, in his painting, especially early on, you can see him exploring the artistic resources for visually representing similarity. So as he sought to find ways around painting or drawing with his hands, Warhol used stamps or stencils to produce, this is also from the Ladies and Gentlemen series, it's a beautiful drawing. Warhol himself in drag from the 80s. Here we have the Campbell Soups. Here he's using stamps or stencils to produce this series of images that appear to be nearly identical, but for the fact that they're different kinds of soup. What we see in Warhol's paintings are a collection of similars. These soup can images are all imitating a model, which all makes them like each other as well, right? We don't look at this painting and think, oh, there's a picture of 200 soup cans like on a shelf or something, right? These are clearly images that are stamped out and based on imitation. And although that's the emphasis on similarity and is evident enough there, when he discovered the silkscreen technique in 1962 with the dollar bill paintings, this he found was a much better way to actually emphasize similarity. He liked the technology, and it seems like he was the first one to do this. The silk screen, right, where you sort of make this screen and then you press the paint through it. Because in contrast to the stamp or the stencil, similarity producing mistakes and irregularities were built into the process. So here's Warhol. With silk screening, you pick a photograph, you blow it up, you transfer it in glue onto silk, and then you roll ink across so the ink goes through the silk, but not through the glue. That way you get the same image, slightly different each time. The effect of the slightly different similar is especially evident in these late 1962 silk screens of celebrities. You can see it here in the dollar bills as well, the sort of variation depending on how hard you push down or how much ink went through. Here you see an installation shot of these prints of Jackie Kennedy. Here we have Natalie Wood. You can really see the emphasis on mistakes and variation, right? It's all the same model, but they all vary. Here you can again see the variation. You get some faces here that are almost entirely black, in fact. Here we have Elvis, Troy Donahue, Walter Beatty. I think we can see Warhol's efforts to produce similarities and draw our attention to them, in fact, across the wide range of his aesthetic commitments, including his affection for bad acting, his imitation of the machine, his fascination with drag queens, his promotion of boredom, and his energetic collecting, which encompass not only collectible things like cookie jars, jewelry, cutlery, art, furniture, and Native American rugs, but also vast numbers of photographs, his own and others, perfumes, his own drawings of feet and cocks. He's sitting on chairs. Sorry, these are a little bit out of order here. Teapots, endless teapots. Here we have his drawings of feet and cocks. There's like hundreds of these. His Polaroids of genitalia, thousands of hours of tape recordings made with his Norelco tape recorder. Here he is holding his tape recorder, which he called his wife, and the 472 screen tests. And I had a couple of those in here of Allen Ginsberg, Rufus Collins, Anne Buchanan, Allen Ginsberg, that he made 472 of these between 1964 and 1966. The hundreds of commissioned portraits, his time capsules, which were cardboard boxes filled with all the printed matter that passed through his hands, mail, photographs, newspaper clippings, poems, invitations, magazines, along with drawings, clothes, toys, the occasional food item, and just about anything else that didn't have another collection to fit it into. Collections, in as much as they bring together groups of similar things through practices of everyday liking, right? Collections are based on bringing things together that are similar in one way or another, dramatize this sort of mode of attraction that I think Warhol tried to promote, based not on lack, you want what you don't have, but based on plenitude and accumulation. You like what you already have a lot of. In fact, and I think there's a case to be made that Warhol tried to have a collector's relationship to nearly every object of perception that he came into contact with, as a way to orient himself on a daily basis toward similarity, so that he's relating to things sort of constantly in relation to similarity. And technology was a fantastic help here. Oh, the Endangered Species, which is in the Rochester show. I feel like you can also think about it as a collection of similars, things that are endangered. I was going to mention technology as a real aid for him in bringing things together. He's constantly photographing, so everything, he can sort of think about objects of visual perception going into this collection of photographs, and you can see him photographing also sort of collections of similar objects. But let me return to liking for a second. It has to be admitted that liking things, never mind liking everything and everybody, is an unexpected, almost scandalous project to set for oneself. Indeed, if you think of Facebook, liking everything on Facebook would totally ruin their algorithm, which is based, of course, on judging your preferences for some things over others. Not only does it disrupt the algorithmic prediction of consumption, liking everything also certainly represents a departure from scholarly skepticism, and it's directly opposed to what we usually think of as the exercise of taste or political judgment, both of which involve liking some things and not liking others. But I think there's something utopian at work here for Warhol. It's an effort, his sort of this project of liking everything, which of course is an impossible task, is an effort to imagine a world that doesn't exist, which is attractive to the extent to which it repairs the problems in this world. It seems possible, for instance, that Warhol was helped to imagine himself as likable, as someone who could be liked in a world that everything and everybody is likable, where nobody is not, at least in some way, like everybody else, and where therefore everyone can enter into relations of imitation and resemblance. Embedded in Warhol's I like everybody may be the wish, everybody likes me. What about liking and likeness? How do these things fit together? I feel like it's intuitive, it's embedded in the history of the word itself, but it's worth thinking further about. And Warhol puts a spin on this in a, and I'm just going to leave this up here in this way. This is a quote from his philosophy. How do you get from a world filled with likenesses, Campbell soup cans and movies and stars, to one in which it's easier to like things? And he puts a kind of melancholic spin on it in this passage from the philosophy of Andy Warhol, which, along with his popism, I can enthusiastically recommend as just a great read. So here's Warhol. If you see a person who looks like your teenage fantasy walking down the street, it's probably not your fantasy. But someone who had the same fantasy as you and decided, instead of getting it or being it, to look like it. And so he went to the store and bought the look that you both like. So forget it. Just think about all the James Deans and what it means. So I think Warhol's pointing out here is the person you like is already like you. In fact, that's why you like him or her, even if you don't know it. She or he had the same fantasy that you had and failed, like you, to get it or be it. You weren't able to be James Dean, or you weren't able to get him as a boyfriend either. In response, the person you see on the street has decided instead to look like James Dean. You, on the other hand, have adopted the related strategy of imprinting your desire with this image, so that you like people who look like James Dean. Both processes involve a mimetic copying in response to an experience of loss or failure. We're all miming what we miss. So when Warhol says, so forget it, about the person you find attractive on the street, who you think might be your fantasy, he's not advising you to forget your attractions or to refrain from picking up the person who looks like your fantasy. Rather, what you need to forget is the idea that you can ever have or be your fantasy object, that you ever are a self without some internalized object you're imitating, and that we only like those objects that look like ones about which we have already fantasized. And so I'll go back here now to the images, and you can see if picture James Dean. There's another, someone who looks like James Dean. Put differently and more abstractly, Warhol's encouraging us to forget the sense that we have to relate to others either by desire, having the thing, or identification, being the thing. Instead, he seems to be reminding us, since ourselves are formed through a process of imitation, so too our likes are always repetitions of past likes, transferences, as Freud called them, of earlier attractions or past emotional ties onto an object in the present. We're each of us going back to the Marilyn or Elvis or James Dean model, which we may see as themselves repetitions of earlier images of our parents, and reprinting it on new material. The fact that our, the society of mass culture, plenty of other people are going to be imitating the same models means there are going to be people out there who look like your fantasy, and that there's a good chance that someone will like the look that you bought too. This is Warhol's boyfriend from the 80s, John Gould. What makes us all look and act alike then, to go back to Warhol's words in his interview, is a shared relation to and reliance upon consumption, which banks on and repeats the same structure of human relationality, ever and again offering the promise of being like the object you didn't get and couldn't be. I think Warhol was, let me see, I'll open up the chat here so I can see it. as I go. So here's the thing. I think Warhol was most compelled by the ways that we could kind of voluntarily become alike each other. And he talks about like taking drugs as one way to do that. So, if everyone is like taking amphetamines or everyone's like smoking marijuana, your perception, your mood is kind of all changed in a similar way. And he was impressed with the people who hung out at the factory who were all taking amphetamines and the way that it sort of brought them all together into this group. Being a fan and imitating a star was another way to do that. And one way to see these celebrity portraits, such as the Marilyns here, are as representations of her fans, who've all kind of incorporated or are all imitating her in their own way. Like the screened images that we see here, so too our own singularity in Warhol's, I think, way of seeing the world, our own singularity, our own individuality derives not from something in some internal essence, but rather from the ways that we fail to imitate, the flaws and the mistakes and their accumulation and their juxtaposition, the places that we can't match up to our models when, like here, too much ink was pushed through or caked on, or when the pressure was a little uneven. Each of us copies our models in our own distinct and imperfect way. And so if you see the world in terms of similarities instead of identities, I think for Warhol, there's no normal or abnormal. There's no like wrong way to be. And I think this was one of his ways of managing or repairing his sense of his own weirdness, of being unable to fit into what he called stock roles. He had a lot of problems that he was embarrassed by, that he felt needed to be managed, which he openly talked about. First and foremost, his sexual attraction to men, but also his identification with femininity, also his baldness, his immigrant working class background, and his odd and unusually white skin. But instead of trying to like work harder to find a way to fit in, he tried to make a world or imagine a world in which nobody fit in which everyone was kind of not fitting in or misfitting together. After all, we're all trying to imitate some model. First of all, of course, our parents, and failing to greater or lesser degrees. And by focusing on similarity, this variability emerges. And Warhol's flamboyance, his flamboyant queerness, loses its stigmatizing effect. So throughout his career, I think he's trying to remind us of the common objects in our world through which we might voluntarily become similar to each other. So he was, he approved when this college student in like 1962 or 1961 wrote him, her name was Susie Stanton, about his Campbell Soup paintings. And this is what, he liked it so much that he just reprinted her paper as the invitation to his show. Here's Stanton. I love soup, and I love it when other people love soup too, because then we can all love it together and love each other at the same time. This might sound naive, but it's worth remembering that it accurately, if optimistically, recalls one of the ways of feeling that supported the social movements of the 1960s. Many of the struggles of the civil rights movement, for instance, at lunch counters, were about asserting similarity in the face of its denial at sites of consumption. And it's with the civil rights movement that I want to conclude here. I'm probably going over a little bit of time, so I apologize. Jim Crow racism, segregation, would seem to be the very paradigm of the thing that Warhol's dedication to liking and likeness sought to oppose. When Warhol insisted in 1963 that people were becoming more and more alike, and that he thought that everybody should like everybody, the violent responses to the civil rights movement were in full force. It's 1963. This is the summer of the bombing of the Baptist church in Birmingham. It's the end of that summer that King gave his, the famous speech. media attention focused the public on police violence against protesters across the South, especially in Birmingham, home of notorious police chief Bull Connor. And it was photos from one such confrontation published in the May 17th, 1963 issue of Life magazine that served as the source material for the Race Riot paintings. And there's a print from that he did a little bit later from this series in the show. So this is the mustard Race Riot diptych. This is the pink Race Riot. This is a group of smaller Race Riots. So I want to focus on something fairly specific in thinking about these paintings, and that is how they represent skin and skin color as itself a way of creating and reinforcing difference, racial difference. Skin, of course, around that time that the Atlantic slave trade got going, became the most visible sign of race, what allows us to think that we know something about somebody just by seeing the hue of their skin. This reading or this interpretation of skin is a process that Warhol was interested throughout his career, and it may have been because of his own odd-looking skin, which was often remarked upon by acquaintances. David Bowie said, what struck me is he's the wrong color. This man is the wrong color to be a human being. So, I think he talks about this elaborate procedure for putting makeup on every day to try to make his skin look normal. So I think he was attuned to skin. He thought about skin as a problem, as something from which might be alienating or stigmatizing. And one of the ways that we're taught what race is in the United States, of course, is by way of the opposition between black and white colors. It goes without saying that don't actually describe anyone's actual skin. And my claim about these works here, what I want to draw attention to is the way that he focuses on the relationship between the aesthetic opposition between black and white, right? The sort of these colors of black and white photography, black and white, on the page, on the one hand, and the racial opposition between black and white on the other. How does our perception of the aesthetic opposition affect how we think about racial difference? So how does it play out in these? How does that opposition play out in these images? Obviously, these images dramatize the violence necessary to enforce the color line. Race Riot, it should be noted, it's not clear who came up with that title. I don't think Warhol came up with that title. But we don't see a riot here. What we see is police violence against an unarmed, nonviolent citizen. A couple things. The image depicts the white agents of state racism here much more clearly than it does the victim of racism. Right, take a look. You can see the police faces quite clearly here, whereas the man's face is obscured. This corresponds to the way that Martin Luther King was thinking about the role of photography in the civil rights movement when he wrote about, and I think I have the quote here. The importance of images that catch the brutality of white supremacy as a fugitive from a penitentiary is often caught in gigantic circling spotlights. There, in a luminous glare, it could be itself exposed, critiqued, and opposed. In other words, King's emphasis was not on giving a face to Black suffering, but giving a face to racism. So the image, in representing the faces of the police conducting the attack so clearly, correspond to what King is talking about here. Indeed, the image itself seems to, in denying a face to this man being attacked here, seems to illustrate the denial of personhood fundamental to the white supremacy that the police are here enforcing. But of course, it's not the police who've covered the face in ink and opposed this man's defacement to the clear white facedness of the police. Rather, this is the result of mediation, of light written on film and ink printed on paper. The white faces are visible inasmuch as their skin is represented by the unmarked white paper background, and the metaphor of blackness to describe persons whose skin is in fact various shades of brown. In this way, these photographic images often a dramatic illustration of the correspondence that I mentioned a minute ago about the aesthetic opposition between black ink and white paper, and the racial opposition between black and white. It's well known that the photographic medium and the print medium are themselves racial technologies. This is an article from the New York Times about the racial bias built into photography, right? The point here is that these media, in presuming white faces as the norm, establish elements and default settings that presume light-colored faces, which produces all kinds of problems that have been famously documented now in a number of art shows. These racializing aspects of photography in the print medium are highlighted, I think, by Warhol in his treatment of the images. So how does he do that? In several ways. One, he intensifies the black-white opposition, right? Note here, please make contrasts very black and white. Right, so he's thinking about kind of intensifying that opposition as it's turned into a screen. Second, the printedness of the opposition is emphasized by the way the black abstractness of the face of the demonstrator in the original photo is intensified by the silkscreen process. And you can really see that in these close-ups, which are even blockier than the sort of dot pattern on the prints. The printedness is often thematized and emphasized by the variation in the image itself. Some versions of the demonstrator's inked face are indeed more abstract and blocky, some less so. What one sees, in other words, in this painting completely depends on the variabilities of the printing process, and it's sort of obvious if you're looking at the paintings. The other thing that he's doing here is the background is not white. He draws attention to the background, right? And in this painting, the background, it's not only is it pink, but you can like clearly see that it was painted on, right? You can see the brush marks there. And then in the mustard, the background, it's like he's got a blank screen there next to the one with the images on it, as if to say, look, think about the background. This is the background. And these background colors, it should be noted, I was going to say a word about background. The wallpaper does this too, the cow wallpaper, right? You put that on the, so he puts this in galleries behind his works. And all of a sudden, and then so you look at a bunch of works and then you get used to this. I mean, the background becomes the foreground. And then you leave the gallery and you're like, yeah, why are gallery walls white? Like, what is that about? How come white is like the background or the norm or the backdrop, the thing that's unseen, right? So he's drawing attention to backgrounds here. And the colors themselves, although yellow and pink might be closer to actual skin colors than black and white, these are not, it's not like he's trying to, imitate skin in these colors. This is not oil painting, right? It's very flat. You don't have any sense of flesh beneath these images. So what do I think he's overall? What's happening here? I think that the other thing is that these images are huge, right? They're like at a nearly cinematic scale, so they're quite affecting. They're quite, you sort of can't help but look at them. I think the representation of skin, the focus on the representation of skin without the suggestion of flesh, the focus on the surface of the painting as itself containing nothing, having nothing behind it, on printing mistakes, on variability, on ink splotches, might lead us to question the reliability of the correspondence between the black-white ink paper opposition and the racial opposition. Indeed, as Warhol disorients usual modes of racial seeing, we might begin to question the capacity of any image technology to accurately represent skin, any skin, and in turn, we might then start to doubt skin's function itself as a sign of some truth or knowledge about the body it covers. Surfaces here are presented as nothing other than themselves. There's nothing behind them. There's no truth to be found there. To be sure, for the usual viewer at the museum, this includes me, this all works sort of unconsciously on the level of feeling or attitude. But I think the aim here in unconsciously disrupting some of our usual ways of seeing race and drawing attention to the way that print and photographic media create and construct racial difference and may promote dislike, Warhol's encouraging a more affecting and disturbing viewing experience, where viewers' own sense of distance from the images may be less manageable. I suspect that such distance was, after all, one common aim of many white, even liberal viewers of these images, who might have said something like, I'm not racist like Bull Connor. This has nothing to do with me. It's as if Warhol is saying, and he does this, taking away the sort of framing of the headlines helps here too. No, look at this. This is the world you're in too. You're implicated by these images. And liking in this sense, I think, means being effectively emotionally open to something. 3 more minutes and I'll be done. As the artist Carol Walker put it, the pink race riot, thinking of liking, so back to liking. What does liking mean in this? What does it mean to like this image? Carol Walker, put it, the pink race riot is weirdly affirming. It's weirdly affirming the absurdity of everything, of you, of me, of violence, of art, of race, of the idea of having a whole humanity and our whole stupid history. So it's not that we're to like Bull Connor's dogs attacking demonstrators in the sense of enjoying these violent occurrences, but we are to affirm them. We're to be open to them as events in the world. This is an openness, of course, which may be disrupting, disorienting, even deranging. But Warhol's inviting us to have whatever feelings we have about them, rather than blocking them, rather than like being overwhelmed by them, to acknowledge that they're in the world and that one is already implicated and affected by them. This, I think, is not empathy or sympathy in the sense that we usually use those terms. It's not identification. It's not like, that's me. It's more like what we might think of as a kind of compassion. If by compassion, we go back to the roots of compassion and talk about it sort of a co-experience of a passion, a kind of disturbing feeling that problematizes the notion of a separate or separable self, a feeling of sharedness that might then produce a recognition that one's own being is already tied up with the being of others, right? I think it's a kind of a contagiousness, a sort of a lack of boundaries. And finally, along these lines, I would draw your attention to the members of the group in the background, who are clearly occupied with and compelled by the events around them. For the most part, they're not looking at what we as viewers are looking at, right? They seem to be looking at something outside of the photograph's frame, perhaps another more urgent outrage. In as much as they look away from what they see, they don't suggest themselves so much as figures for us as viewers. They're not looking at what we're looking at, but they do remind us that viewers of this event do constitute a group, and a group that is itself implicated and involved in the events unfolding before it. And in this group, Black being is not defaced or destroyed. You can see these faces. They're energized and active. And it's a group with which anyone angry about the white supremacist violence on view might seek to join, to feel with, to be with. It's as if the image itself offers a reminder not to look for answers to the problems posed in this image within the image. Look outside the frame and do it together as a group. In this, Warhol's Race Riot paintings provide a scene for viewers to look at the images there, to be disturbed by them, and then, like the spectators, we see in the background to look away from these images, feeling outrage at the white supremacist state with collective action in mind, which is all really that you can ask for from a work of art these days. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Fascinating. And a number of questions are being asked, and I'm going to help moderate these questions. One is rather straightforward. I want to get this one out of the way. Someone asks, what is the source of the teenage fantasy James Dean writing?
Oh yeah, that's the philosophy of Andy Warhol from A to B and back again. It's a book from 1975. It's widely available. It's like hilarious and sort of oddly wise. There's like good advice in there. So I can highly recommend it.
Okay, a lot of questions, or a few at least, about liking. No surprise. One question: how did Warhol's strategy of liking change over the course of his career? There are so many Warhols, after all.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it remained fairly consistent, actually. So in his late work, I mean, but he sort of kept expanding it or finding new ways to think about it. And it's interesting to think about his TV work, his magazine work, as efforts to kind of expand the zones into which he could create groups of similarities. If you look at all the interview covers, I mean, it's like I feel like he thought about interview itself as a space to collect groups of people together, and he kind of used the social world around interview also as a way to socialize, as a way to group people together. You think about him going to whatever Studio 54 famously in the 1970s. I mean, I think one thing that did happen in the 1970s is after Stonewall and the sort of modern, gay and lesbian rights movement, I think he became more confident in his imitation of femininity, his affection for femininity, his identity, and his attraction to men. And so I think you see increasingly homoerotic work across all the media. So that's an interesting thing to think about and to trace out too. And in his late work, he kind of brings in religion actually in an interesting way into this sort of zone of liking. And there's a certain religiosity to his like everything, be open to everything, don't reject anything, kind of let it all in. So anyway, that's just off the top of my head, but I think that's some ways to think about that.
Yeah, I think of the way in which he, for the most part, made all of his society portraits 40-inch square, so that people who didn't know each other, didn't hang out with each other, if a museum or some organization were able to get a bunch of those society portraits together, you just put them up next to each other, they fit together, and they're meant to go with each other, really, because of the format, which kind of another way to add to what you're saying. So here we have a question. Warhol was once politically and socially engaged, witnessed the race riots, suicide, and car crash paintings, and the electric chair prints. Political engagement amounts to strongly liking some things instead of other things. Warhol disliked Nixon at one point, for example, his Vote McGovern image, acrid green skin. Warhol did not have boundless cultural interests in, say, the musical or literary canon. His interest in the humanities was rather limited. Furthermore, if Warhol loved everything uncritically, his work would be all over the place. It is not. If he loved everything uncritically, he would not have established a signature technique, style, or imagery. Outstanding artists work within the set of parameters they set. Warhol is an outstanding artist. So that's more of a comment, but it actually, I think that, well, no, that's more of a comment. Maybe you would like to respond to it. Because he's basically, it sounds to me like you're sort of more than not believing what Warhol says about himself. And um, this comment might be reminding us to maybe not believe everything that Warhol says about his art.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. It's a good comment. It's a smart comment, and a fair one. I guess I would say a couple things. It's an impossible project, liking everything. It's a utopian project, right? But I guess I'm not so much taking Warhol as his word as I'm trying to find a way to think about bringing all of his work together. And I'm impressed by the persistence with which Warhol pursues the project of assembling things that are similar to each other, his persistence in organizing things in terms of likenesses, and his persistence of this, so on a formal level, right? Just sort of looking at the work on a formal level, I think it's a helpful approach to sort of think about, okay, how is he, what's he doing with similarity in this work? And I think he's committed to this project of emotional openness or liking throughout. I think it's also important to distinguish liking from loving. I think Warhol was very pointed. He said, I don't believe in love. I kind of believe in liking. Liking is weaker, right? It's a weaker feeling than love. It's not about commitment. It's not about liking is that initial kind of elemental openness to something. It's like interest, right? I'm going to pay attention to this and be open to what it's saying to me. You're right that he had to place limits, and he sort of joked about this at points in his life. He was like, Chinese art is so interesting, but there's so much of it. If I get interested in Chinese art, I'll never be able to stop. I'll just spend the rest of my life like interested in Chinese art. So, there's obviously there's an infinity of things to be interested in. So you have to place limits. Anyway, it's a long conversation, a long debate that we could have about how seriously we want to take this project. But
do you think, and going to another question which ties in, what's your opinion of Warhol's strategy of liking? Is the utopian intention or interpretation, as you describe it, actually a way to create a better future, or is it pernicious, a reactionary or regressive impulse?
I like his strategy of liking. I myself have learned from it. I find myself in the book, I tried not to criticize any other critics. It's a sort of standard academic move where you sort of distinguish what you're saying by saying these other people are saying all this other stuff and they're wrong and I'm right because I have the like smarter analysis. And I sort of to try to take seriously my own argument, I tried to instead focus on, even with critics that I disagreed with on some level, I found the points of similarity. I found the places where we were saying something similar, and so tried to highlight those. I think it's an interesting way to approach the world, and I guess I'm persuaded that it's especially good way to approach the world as an intellectual or an artist, because I guess I think that in order to understand something, you have to first like it. You have to let it in. You have to be open to what it actually is. And I think Warhol saw that one of the key problems in our world is we don't let most things in. We block most things out. And it's a survival strategy, right? I mean, it's like, I can't, I stopped listening to the news after the 2016 election because it just, at the end of the day, I would have a nervous breakdown if I listened to the news every day. So it's, it's like, it's hard to let everything in. And we put up these sort of defense mechanisms. And I think Warhol's suggesting an alternative strategy where we do as much as we can to let things in, and to be open to things. So yeah, I think it's I think it's I like it, and I think it's relevant at the present moment. when, obviously the country is riven by the sense of differences that are insurmountable, and a sense of hatred, and very strong, aggressive, feelings against others. So I feel like in that context, it's it doesn't really even fit into the political schemas that we usually use to sort of judge or organize the world. It's kind of like a meta strategy, um, for relating to the whole thing in a way that kind of displaces the usual binary oppositions. And I guess for me, that's one of the real usefulnesses of thinking about similarity, is it's not same or different. It's a third thing, right? Which allows for distinctness and individuality, without presuming opposition or incommensurability.
Beautifully stated. Thank you. Uh, we have here a comment. Thank you for your talk, Jonathan, and thank you for your book, which has been a gift to Warhol scholarship. I wanted to ask if you might comment on one of the early names for pop art coined, I think, by curator Walter Hopps, that never quite stuck, commonism. I often think of this phrase, especially in relation to Warhol. It seems to speak to some of the issues of generating, inspiring similarity, likeness that your talk and book consider. Do you think it could be helpful to resurrect this phrase in relation to Warhol and pop more generally? The obvious pun on communism would open up further discussion, as well as Warhol's relation to leftist politics is also interesting to consider in this context.
Yeah, I actually have a whole riff in the book about communism. And I thought even of doing a whole project on communism. No, it's a great phrase, and I think in a way it more accurately captures Warhol's project than pop does. Because I think what his ceaseless attraction is to objects of common feeling. First of all, commodities and stars, these common objects as places that our feelings can come together. And I think it's so in that sense that I feel like it really describes what he's doing. But it also, in that early interview, he talks about how people are becoming more and more like in Russia, just like they are in the United States. So I feel like he's also trying to bridge, one of the most significant divides at that moment, which is the Cold War divide, and to suggest that mass production in the Soviet Union makes us similar to Soviet citizens, right? In other words, even if we're not consuming the same commodities, we are both familiar with the process of sharing objects of consumption with millions of other people. So, and I think that he sees 20th century personhood as basically shaped by that process of sharing objects of consumption with millions of other people. And he's trying to focus in on that shared space of commonality as a space where we might actually come together. So obviously he couldn't, communism wasn't picked up, but I feel like it's a great phrase, and there's lots to think about there.
Walter Hopps was a smart man. We're running out of time. I'm going to offer this last comment, which is posted. Hi, Jonathan. Thank you so much for this presentation. I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on what you've been discussing as Warhol's mediation of social issues and what seems to me a rhetorical dimension of his work through liking to create something that affects our common sense worldviews. I don't know if I understand it too well enough, but what's being said here. But here, would you relate this to the other work you've done on reading and mood and how affect saturates cultural production?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll say two things. Hi, Matt. I mean, I know Matt. So, I'd say two things. One, in terms of his mediation of social issues, I mean, I feel like his mediation of race in this instance is pretty specific, it's about this sort of aesthetic opposition between black and white and the racial opposition between black and white, and it has to do with his interest in in racial technology, we might call racial technologies, or the way that we see race and the role that skin, our perception of skin, plays in that seeing. So I feel like there's a kind of specific operation at work here, and I feel like you can actually trace that through. In the book, I connect that up also to his use of black and white in the Marylands. You'll notice that some of the Marylands are completely black. So he's drawing attention to, the way that celebrity might be a kind of blackening, or he might be thinking about the multiracial quality of Maryland's fans. James Baldwin has a whole riff on his identification with Marilyn Monroe that's really interesting. In the Ladies and Gentlemen works, but more generally, I guess, thinking about his approach to, I don't know, the political issues of our day or political images, I think he's trying to find a way around what I described earlier as this sort of emotional blockage that we have, or kind of, a shield that we put up to keep out what is, after all, a tremendous amount of suffering of other people, and disturbing. And, if you let all that in, it would be difficult to keep going. It's like Warhol's trying to find a way outside of, making use of the mass media, but sort of stepping aside the mass media to let more in, to let ourselves be more affected, but to do it in a way that doesn't, where we let go of our idea of ourselves as like self-determined individuals who are like, it's about me, Jonathan Flatley, and what I'm doing, but about kind of entering into a space of commonality, into a sort of more of a common space. And there, I think it has a lot to do with mood. And in fact, I think the way you do this, I don't think you can just like decide to like things. I don't know if you've tried this, but you listen to a song and you're like, actually, I don't like it. And then you're like, okay, but I'm going to like it. I'm going to make myself like it. It's hard to do. I think what Warhol does is it works on the level of mood, this kind of general affective orientation. And I think the way that he gets himself in the mood for liking is by attuning himself to similarity, by attuning himself to likenesses. So if you think about it, collecting, if you're sort of in a collecting mood in which you're relating to everything in terms of their similarity to something else, that allows you to have a different emotional relationship to things than you might otherwise have. It allows you to like things, in other words. So I think that Warhol, is operating on the level of this sort of more general overall feeling, like mood or atmosphere. So that was a long answer to a good and complicated question.
Yes, we are indeed out of time. I want to thank you, Jonathan, so much for helping us to celebrate and kick off this season of Warhol. I liked your talk. I liked it a lot, and I learned a lot from it, frankly. And commonism, great new way to think about Warhol's aesthetic. So we hope everyone enjoyed today's program. Don't forget to purchase, or if you're a member, reserve your time tickets to the museum. Check out mag.rochester.edu for information on the programs we have planned for this season of Warhol. Jonathan, thank you very, very much for joining us and for sharing your scholarship, your thoughts, and your kindness with us. We appreciate it. All right.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.